Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 7th office hour for the MOOC on Environmental Security and Sustaining Peace. I'm Carl Bruch, and I direct international programs at the Environmental Law Institute. I'm here today with Richard Matthew. Richard is one of the core faculty for this course. Richard is Professor of International and Environmental Politics in the Schools of Social Ecology and Social Science at the University of California at Irvine. He's also the director of the Center for Unconventional Security Affairs and the director of the Blum Center for Poverty Alleviation, a UC-wide initiative. He has research interests. He studies the environmental dimensions of conflict and peace building, climate change adaptation in conflict and post-conflict societies, and transnational threat systems. He's done extensive field work in conflict zones in South Asia and East, Central, and West Africa. Today, we'll be answering a mix of questions, some that were submitted by students ahead of today's session, and some that we are receiving from you live. We'll do our best to get through all of them. If we don't, we encourage you to post your questions in the office hours and other discussion groups. And so before we get started on the substance, Richard, maybe you'd like to say a little bit more about yourself and your work?
Sure, Carl. I mean, I think that you summarized it well. A couple of things. I spent a lot of time working in certain parts of the world, especially Nepal, Pakistan, and then in Sierra Leone and Rwanda. And I've had the pleasure of being part of UN peacebuilding missions in several of those countries, as well as an academic. So I've been able to get a perspective as an insider in the environmental peacebuilding process, as well as a sort of observer of it. And these days, much of my work focuses on trying to bring sort of state-of-the-art big data, spatial analysis, modeling, mapping tools into this space, because I think there's a lot of interesting opportunity to help with peace building using sort of sophisticated, visual technologies.
Richard, one of the interesting things, I'm here in Toronto right now for the International Studies Association meeting, and I would say in the last 3 meetings, starting in Baltimore and then San Francisco and here, there's been quite a bit of discussion about how the practitioners have gotten out in front of the academics on a lot of the understanding of the linkages between environment, conflict, and peace. And so there's now a lot of talk about what's the conceptual framework for what we're doing. And wait, there isn't much of a conceptual framework. And I'm wondering, you've worked kind of on both sides of this quite substantively. I wonder if you might comment on both on the experience of bridging and where you think the field needs to go, particularly on the research side.
I mean, great question. I think that there has been a tendency in the academic world, especially in the social sciences, to be more alert to and more responsive to other academics and to the problems that they're identifying, maybe methodological problems or what have you. So there's a tendency to focus very heavily on journal articles and the problems that they describe. And I think there's been less engagement with practitioners than there was when the field started. International relations started as a field which was very closely linked to practitioners. There was an enormous amount of back and forth as we worked our way through things like understanding World War, understanding the Cold War, understanding the implications of nuclear weapons, and so on. But over time, I think the academic world started to shift as it built a huge architecture of journals and conferences and a world of its own. Some people think this is a great thing, a type of detachment, a type of independence from the practitioner world. But I think it's meant that often practitioners are doing things and operating in ways that the literature hasn't caught up with. And so there's a tendency to stereotype what peace building is or what the UN does based on older understandings. I think that the solution is for academics to get out there, to get out into the field and to become objective observers of what's really going on, and maybe loosen a little bit the focus on the problems, the methodological problems identified in journals.
One of the things that has come up a lot here has been the what's the relevance of theory? How does this actually inform practice on the ground?
I mean, I think. Oh, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just wondering, how important is it to develop the conceptual frameworks for environmental peace building and environmental security?
I mean, I think that on the one hand, we have a very, very complicated world. And so good theory helps us sort of simplify it and sort of identify those things that are really important to focus on, those variables that might have the largest impact. And it does so not based just on anecdote and experience, but on larger bodies of evidence, so that it can sort of correct things. Theory can also sort of raise questions about the extent to which what we're doing really aligns with what we profess we believe in or value, and so on. So it can play an explanatory function. It can play a critical function. Sometimes it can help us by developing models that have some predictive value to them. So I think theory is important, but theory has to be usable. It has to be appropriate. It has to be something that resonates positively with people's real experiences, and that they say, this gives me a better understanding of my options, or this gives me a better understanding of what scenarios might unfold, or this helps me to understand why there's criticism of what we're doing. When theory doesn't do those very fundamental functions, then I think it probably isn't terribly valuable. But I think in a complicated world, there's a role for people who can help simplify it in constructive ways.
We have a few student questions related to your work on climate change in conflict-affected countries.
You bet.
The first one is, where do you see conflict-affected countries making the most progress in climate change adaptation and mitigation? Where do you hope these efforts will progress over the next decade or so?
Wow, that's a big question. I think that when we look at what's happening in places like Malawi and so on right now, and we look at that at the trajectories of flooding and the trajectories of fire and drought in conflict-sensitive areas, fragile areas, we can't be overly optimistic by the amount of progress. Do I think that some countries have absolutely? I think that throughout South Asia and West Africa and the Great Lakes region, there's been some awareness of potential increases in flooding and drought and what this means and how this might affect agriculture and so on. But I would be hesitant to say there's been a lot of progress in places. I look at Pakistan or Sri Lanka or Nepal, and these places have those places that I've worked in, and they have still enormous climate-related challenges ahead of them. Bangladesh, today has big challenges. I think that in Western Africa, much of Sub-Saharan Africa, we see big challenges. People continue to move heavily into very fragile areas that climate scientists have said, this is a really dangerous area. You will experience flooding and drought and heat waves, but people tend to prefer those fragile areas by a factor, I think, of about 4 to 1. So,
why is that?
Because there's lots of water in them sometimes. That's one area. One reason, because they're where fresh water and salt water, so there's transportation opportunities. But where you have things like fresh water and salt water meeting, you do open up enormous water and transportation opportunities, but you also set yourself right in the heart of a floodplain almost inevitably. So then, historically people have built defenses to make those places habitable, channels and so on, but they're being overwhelmed. So people are attracted to areas that are flat, areas that are exposed, areas where there's lots of water moving around, and those areas are becoming very difficult to manage. That's part of the reason.
It seems like some of the things that we've also seen elsewhere they're often pilot projects, but efforts to introduce renewables, especially off the grid, as ways for people who don't have access to any electricity to have access to a sustainable, whether it's micro hydropower or solar or?
I mean, I think that the opportunity of small-scale energy provision is enormous. Solar power makes sense, you know, in many. The startup costs can be steep in a lot of situations, and storage can be a challenge in a lot of places still. But you know, there's certainly opportunities for biogenerating energy, and for, you know, small scale hydro plants, and for small scale solar activity, and so on. So there's certainly a lot of opportunity, but I think it's one of those areas where technology is not very well aligned with policy and with investment. So we're not seeing the big movement in these directions that theoretically would be possible.
So along those lines, one of the things that Mark Levy highlighted in Haiti was the fact that after they put in a lot of, I think it was solar power, it worked for a bit, and then there were needs for maintenance and repair, and there was no endogenous capacity, no capacity in country to do the repairs, and so things quickly fell apart. It was interesting to see in Afghanistan, there's a project, it was just in the news 2 weeks ago, to train women in particular to maintain solar panels and link-ups. Yeah, so I thought that was an interesting bit of learning on how to provide that facilitating environment for renewables, and particularly for solar.
I mean, I think that's in some ways that's the story of technological diffusion, is that it often leads to something being built that proves to be very difficult to maintain, and things go, you know, become antiquated very quickly in our world now. So maintaining, whether it's smartphones or computers or anything else, is a real challenge today, because, you know, things become obsolete very quickly. I would, you know, be skeptical that solar panels installed today are going to be the ones that you want to be maintaining in 20 years, because the technology gets thinner and lighter and more efficient so quickly. So those people who cannot keep up with technology are going to face a struggle maintaining older technologies. I think, and I don't think that's unusual. But I do think it's costly.
I was wondering if you might comment on some of the problematic aspects of adaptation or of mitigation in conflict-affected countries. One example that comes to mind is that we saw over the last 10, 15 years, really 10 years, was a rapid growth in land for fuels in Sierra Leone, South Sudan, and Mindanao. So this is being driven by global demand for biofuels, which leads to land grabbing, which is not a good trend in conflict-affected countries, because it displaces people and generates conflict over who owns the land and all sorts of other dimensions. I'm wondering, are there other places where we've seen climate change-related developments that might be problematic that you need to focus
on? Well, I mean, it seems like there's a couple of things going on here. One, of course, is that the world as a whole is becoming more and more unequal, and that affects what's possible in conflict-affected countries as well. So you have, you know, the higher the level of inequality, the more difficult certain types of behaviors become. I wouldn't say that the entire world is now being focused mainly on money, but it often feels that way a lot of the time. And so you are going to see land grabs and investments that have short-term payoffs in these areas where it's hard to attract, you know, investors who have a long-term perspective, and it's hard to deal with the multiple, you know, conflicts related to land and so on in fragile areas or conflict-affected areas. So I do think that climate change does tend to have a different time horizon for its payoffs, mitigation and adaptation, than a lot of shorter term and more destructive investments have. So we have that challenge that you've got to get a lot of people to work. You want to bring investors in. You want to get infrastructure repaired. You want to get government up and taxes flowing into it so it can start to work. And short-term investments may not make sense from a climate change perspective. How you deal with that is, I think this is an enormous challenge, Carl. I think that, how do we get, we think of the incredibly small amount of money that goes into peace building, given the enormous size of the global economy. You have an $80+ trillion economy, and less than 1%, less than a fraction of 1% is going into peace building activities, even though they affect a score or more countries in the world. So I think there's this enormous inequality, this challenge aligning short-term and or reconciling short-term and longer-term priorities, and we have the same challenge in countries that are not affected by conflict.
Shifting to another question from a student, resilience is an increasingly popular buzzword. In your work, how have you measured and tracked resilience?
I mean, this is resilience is a popular buzzword, and I think it's a difficult one to track in some ways when you have a lot of change taking place. But what we tend to lean on here is looking at how quickly certain types of communities recover from different types of shocks, and what forms of capital. And we use the natural capital, physical capital, social capital, financial capital as a way of identifying what types of capital people have and how quickly they recover, and under what conditions they recover more quickly. And what we tend to find, by the way, is that capital matters a lot, especially things like social capital, and so does information. So the more information people have, the more quickly they're able to recover. I think knowledge and resilience are connected, and in our world at least in some of our research, there's a real gap between who has access to reliable, timely knowledge and who doesn't. But in disaster and conflict situations, those who do have reliable access to appropriate, useful, timely knowledge tend to have a much higher level of resilience than those who do not. They can use their scarce resources much more effectively, whether it's a war, a flood, a drought, what have you, a fire. So I think knowledge is emerging as sort of critical to resilience. Obviously, that's the only thing.
One more question related to climate change. One students, if you might be able to talk about a project or research that you've worked on that improved a community's ability to cope with environmental shocks and/or climate change. And I wonder if this might be an opportunity to talk about some of the mapping work you've done.
Absolutely. So we have projects in Paraguay, Nepal, Malawi, and Mexico, and they're all good examples of this. What we've basically done is we've moved into areas that are where you have extremely high levels of vulnerability, mainly to flooding right now, and scarce resources, poor communities that have low resource, low resources as a matter of as a rule, and we have co-developed with them. So it takes some effort to get this up and running, but we co-develop models that simulate flooding and allow us to play with all sorts of different ways of managing that risk, whether it's digging ditches, changing the angle of roads, cultivating some sort of greenscape. And so we can play with those interventions in the model itself. And by doing that, the local community's knowledge is linked to drone data that we collect and satellite data and other large data sets. So we develop a model where you can look and you can see your street, you can see your house, you can see where water is going to come from, you can see what happens when the government decides to pave this road, you can see what happens when you build a stone wall over here, you can see how the water moves, and we can do one thing that's neat is in the past we could never have done this. It would have been too expensive. But now we can build extremely fine-grained models, and we can run literally thousands of simulations cheaply, so that people can then look at a wide range of scenarios: the flood that they get every decade, the flood they get every 5 years, the flood that happens yearly. And they can start to say, well, what if we, as a community, oppose paving this road? Or what if we, or should this road be graded differently? Or what if we as a community get together and build this wall? What will happen to water? And we can show that. We can answer very explicit questions. What's our best evacuation routes? How do we protect our own property? How do I get to work most effectively if there's a flood? And what we've discovered is a lot of the questions that people have and a lot of the information they have we would not come to you from reading journal articles about the challenges of modeling floods. So you have to talk to people. I'll give you an example. In Tijuana, Mexico, we ran some great models in Los Laureles Canyon, where people face enormous floods, very, very destructive floods. People are killed every year. And people pointed to areas that flooded, which didn't make sense when you look at drone and satellite imagery. But when you get down, you discover that the culverts have all been blocked by car tires and mattresses. And so the water backs up very quickly and affects communities in minutes. So we've developed a sort of social bond scenario for helping remove these trash from a very delicate culvert system, which will take the pressure enormously off flooding and allow people to start to do other things with walls and ditches and so on. Same thing in La Paz. So I think that this type of technology, it's intuitive, it makes sense. People can easily position themselves in it, and people who are dealing with these issues can add their own knowledge. They can say, well, we can't do that. That's private property. We want to be over here. We can do this. We can do that. And so we can sort of play back and forth towards solutions. And they're much, much cheaper to ascertain than digging the ditch or building the wall and hoping it works. So that's been very fruitful. And we're doing it now to see if we can help in the siting of refugee camps in Bangladesh, which have been terribly affected by cyclones and floods.
The shifting gears a little, there was a question about in post-conflict settings, how are environmental management priorities established? And I was thinking this might be a nice opportunity for you to talk about your work on the post-conflict assessment in Rwanda, among others.
Sure. I mean, I think that in the case of Rwanda, the priorities emerged rather slowly. So there was, as we know, in the early days after peace was established, a couple of million people moving into the country. Most of the country, including much of the protected areas, were settled, including marshlands, Akagera, very, very fragile areas were settled very quickly. And so environmental priorities didn't come up until later, by which point they already had terrace farming on very steep terrain. And so they were losing topsoil. It was going into the river system. They were, losing farmland. They were facing the challenges of industry built in swampy areas and close to Kigali and so on. But the priorities were established the way, in the same way they are in most of these situations. It's a combination of talking to local communities, so a lot of outreach outside the capital, talking to conservation groups and to local communities about their priorities, talking to the national government experts, whatever environmentalists, engineers, and so on they have, and then bringing in satellite and other data, whatever bodies of data exist, to slowly start to come to an agreement on what's happened to the forest sector, what's happened to the water sector, what's happened to the mining sector, what's happened to the fisheries, what's happened to different environmental sectors, and what the conditions are, what might be the immediate priorities from an ecological perspective, and then how these play out in terms of creating employment, settling people, creating an environment that may be attractive to investors if that's what they're doing. So it is a lot of discussion to establish priorities. In the reports that I've been involved with in Rwanda and Sierra Leone, most of the time was spent traveling around these countries, observing different situations, taking measurements, talking to people, and then looking back to where there is data to try and get a sense of what's happened and sort of what might be the most important things to deal with.
And so this leads to some sort of document, a report on the environmental situation and priorities in a country.
So it leads to a document, a report that typically describes what may have happened during the war, what the military impact has been, what has been the impact of people exiting, what has been the impact of people developing coping strategies, what has been the impact of people maybe taking advantage of a lawless situation to exploit. So you're looking at mines and timber and fish and water and land and so on. And then based on discussions, what might be some of the priorities, getting this water system up and running, improving this land, dealing with these overgrown plantations, these road challenges, these dust challenges, what have you, leading to usually very concrete set of project recommendations that are again co-developed. So there's maybe a dozen agricultural projects identified and a dozen water projects identified and a dozen energy projects identified, which then feed up into the larger process of national reconstruction as the country, in partnership usually with donor countries in the UN, goes to look for people to fund those projects.
Good. Thank you. We have a few questions related to perspectives in different senses. One is a question about how sanctions relating to natural resources in conflict-affected areas, what impacts do sanctions have on civilians living in those areas? And how do sanctions typically impact livelihood development?
I mean, those are good questions, right? And we know that places like Liberia and Sierra Leone faced significant sanctions. You could look and say the sanctions on forests, the sanctions on diamonds, the sanctions on different things were the impacts were already largely being experienced due to the fact that certain groups had taken over those areas. So the people were already, in a sense, in many cases, feeling deprivation because those areas had been leased out to foreign interests or occupied by rebels or occupied by civil forces or what have you. So the sanctions then, added another layer of challenge, for sure, but they also brought global attention to these things and created a path forward for better wealth sharing, better community-based development of those resources. So I think that it matters greatly what the sanctions are. If it's a complete prohibition on chocolate or coffee or timber from an area, it is going to affect everybody. Probably disproportionately affect those people who are controlling those areas. I think that what often happens is it leads to illegal activity. So things still move around the global economy. Even diamonds moved around the global economy. So sanctions are not perfect, but it does create an opportunity also to renegotiate and come up with a better way of managing the resource that includes a larger role for the community. So I think that in those cases it's mixed, right? There's some obvious cost to everybody, but then over time, at least in those cases, there were benefits to everybody, and both those countries have improved dramatically in terms of sharing the benefits of natural resources better than they were being shared during the war.
There's another question I think is probably focusing on Eastern DRC and the mining there. It's are there unintended consequences of broad due diligence requirements on artisanal miners? If so, do you know where this has been an issue? And
when you say unintended consequences, I mean, obviously one big concern is that when people try to clean up the industry, poor people can't afford to get into it anymore because they can't afford the licenses and they can't afford to meet those requirements. So they sort of end up in great debt because they have to sign on to somebody who can afford the licensing and meeting the requirements. So there is that challenge. Are there other things that you're...
I think that a lot of it is what you were describing, at least what I've heard, that the Dodd-Frank and now the EU conflict mineral regulations that are coming online in early 2021, both of those, well, the requirements under Dodd-Frank seem to have had negative effects on livelihoods because they have difficulty with the licenses. The companies they don't deal with the effort, and so they start sourcing their minerals exclusively from the larger providers or from other regions. So I think that this was one of those things that people were focusing on the livelihoods and the humanitarian devastation, and they weren't necessarily thinking about the implications of livelihoods. And there are a lot of artisanal miners in the area.
That's the exact same pattern I've seen, and I've worked in DRC and in Sierra Leone, where you have a large number of artisanal miners, and attempts to make the industry more sustainable, to clean it up, do impose enormous costs because they usually make the cost of mining more expensive, and so a certain group of people are no longer able to do it on their own and have to work for somebody else, which is often not a great deal.
There's a question that how can the involvement of women in natural resource management and peace building help the issues of crude oil management in the Niger Delta region? And I'm wondering, first of all, I'll say that next week, Celia will be joining us for the office hour, and I think she can really speak well to the involvement of women, and we'll save this as such. But I'm wondering if there's a broader framing here about how do the involvement of different constituencies, of women, of youth, of the local communities, how can this be help the conflict management, the livelihoods, the management of high-value resources around which there's often conflict?
I mean, I think that the one thing we always have to be sensitive about is it can be very difficult to understand the natural resource economy of a given community anywhere in the world, and how resources are handled, and what happens to power relationships and so on in that community when something like the price of a resource goes up dramatically, benefiting one group, or create a situation in which one group is likely to lose control to another. I'll give you an example. When gold prices went up, women who had historically sort of played an important role mining for gold in Sierra Leone lost that position. And that was that was one area in which they were able to create a little bit of savings for themselves, where when men in that economy were focused largely on diamonds. But as gold moved up in value, they were displaced from that mining activity, and they had very little else to turn to. So they were suddenly in a very exposed area with not an easy way to develop such a fungible type of savings. So I do think that global prices, global decisions can have dramatic and huge impacts on places that we have never imagined and simply are not aware of. So again, I think the key is getting out there and observing and speaking to people and trying to figure out what happens when we make these changes in your sector, or when the price changes in your sector. How does this play out? And in our own country, if we're living in a developed country, so I'm talking about the U.S. right now, there are all sorts of things done in advance to try and figure out how people will be impacted by dramatic changes, and large policies that try and protect people from, say, dramatic changes in food, crops, and things like this. And they don't even work perfectly. They're often, not very effective. In places where they don't even have those buffers or those funds or those things, I think it can be completely demoralizing and extremely difficult to be at the mercy of these larger forces. So part of it is trying to understand better what a policy that is going to affect, the value of something, what it is going to do in those places that rely on that value. And I don't think we do a particularly good job of that. In the case of women, they're often, historically linked to certain types of resources, and changes in their access, changes in their value will affect them. It's hard not to imagine that involving them in crafting, policies would ever be anything but a value.
One of the interesting things that I see changing in the last couple of years is that so much of the rhetoric, the discourse, the thoughts about women and marginalized communities, so much of it is about them being victims, that they don't have power, they don't have rights, the rights aren't respected. And I feel like there's been a lot of work to try to protect women in marginalized communities, protect those rights. But there's also been, I would say, a parallel track that has developed around that recognizes their agency, their ability to be involved in decision making and to help improve when decisions, having them involved improves the robustness of the decisions. And so there's kind of there are now two tracks, and people still often focus on the victim side, but the governance side and the empowerment and agency. That seems to be a kind of a newer track that it's kind of exciting.
I mean, I think that Celia will be able to comment, but we happen to do some work on this particular challenge. And I think that one pattern that is evident in much of the world is that women from upper and middle class parts of the economy are starting to become the dominant force in education in many, many countries. And as they do that, if it follows the trajectory of other countries, women from more constrained economic circumstances who are now typically in a much worse position than men will start to move forward. So it's not difficult to imagine that over the next couple of decades, women will start to gain parity or even start to exceed men in terms of educational attainment in many, many countries. And this will start to translate into changes in population growth and in small and medium investments, and probably in local politics and maybe in national politics. So as women become increasingly educated, right now, women outnumber men in colleges in developed countries. I think it's 58% to 42%. So women are becoming this enormous force, and they create a pathway for women in other parts of and other positions in the economy to follow through. I think that the commitment to K through 12 education, if it's seen through around the world, will lead to one of the most dramatic changes in power relations in the world. And that's going to take place whether you're in a small indigenous community in Paraguay, or whether you're in a big city in India, or whether you're in the heart of Europe. Women are becoming more educated. And education is a type of power. So it is going to play out in family size, it's going to play out in family health, it's going to play out in policy preferences, it's going to play out in environmental preferences. I think that if this happens quickly enough, there's grounds for being quite optimistic about what making sure that every woman, every girl in the planet is able to get through grade 12 has the potential to do for our economy and our environment. But I already see very positive signs around the world. That doesn't mean there won't be resistance or challenges or opposition, but what it does mean is that where women are really falling behind men in educational attainment and all the things that go along with that, health, economic, wealth, and so on, is now mainly confined to the poorest parts of each economy in each country. So there is some grounds for being really very, very encouraged by what we're seeing around the world.
There's Richard. There's a very broad question for you. I'm afraid to say this in advance. Just I'm not certain how you, which aspects you want to focus on it. But what is the key takeaway from some of your recent research in post-conflict studies? So, what are some of the things that you think people should know coming out of research? You have so many areas that you work on. I don't know where you start on this.
I mean, right now we're doing some, we're trying to assist in Nepal, which has gone through a war which made it highly vulnerable to disasters, a very common sort of sequence. And if you're vulnerable to one major disaster, you end up being vulnerable to a cascade of disasters. So it is drought, followed by fire, followed by flood, followed by disease outbreak. And I think that on the one hand, the encouraging thing is that we now have a set of tools that connect people, connect information, allow us to experiment with solutions that 5 years ago were too expensive and that we can now use comfortably anywhere in the world. And that means that you can get certain types of expertise into places around the world in ways that you could not before, whether it's to understand, what's happening with a disease outbreak, or to look at different water management strategies, or to predict the outcomes of fire. So that's encouraging. On the other hand, I would say that one of the is that we simply underinvest in these situations and lose interest in them too quickly. And we have to remember that a conflict-sensitive country is probably a disaster-sensitive country, and it's probably also going to be dealing with long-term mental and other health issues. These are big challenges. So so progress in many places has not been as rapid, and you could look at a number of countries in the world and say, well, after 10, 15 years, Rwanda may be an exception, but Congo and Sierra Leone and these other places don't look noticeably better across a lot of parameters. So I think that Nepal doesn't look noticeably better, even though the war is now long over. But although it's made some gains around the constitutions, all this, but basically it's got huge challenges. So I think that I think we've lost you, Carl, but I think that it's a mixed. On the one hand, we're seeing more powerful tools go into these areas. On the other hand, we're not seeing enough serious investment and commitment to turn the corner often.
I'm wondering.
And Carl, I've lost your voice.
Sorry. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Richard? You hear me? Okay, I think that may be a good point to wind up the office hour. I apologize for the technical difficulties, but we were able to get through the questions and encourage people to back for next week's office hours. We will have a guest also on Tuesday, Alexander Verbeek, and then we will welcome Alexander on Tuesday and Celia on Friday. With that, thank you for your attention. Take care.